All that on BBC One, Heart of the Matter, with Joan Bakewell.
Moore's murderers Myra Hindley and Ian Brady were sentenced to life in 1966, but Hindley was recommended for parole 9 years ago. Now the Home Secretary is to tell her how much longer she will serve, and has declared that public opinion will weigh in his judgment. Heart of the Matter examines these new twists to the story that has run for 30 years.
If we ask the questions, can people like Myra Hindley change? Should that change be recognised and even rewarded? Now, if the answer is always going to be a very firm and a very frenzied scream of no, then actually what hope is there for anybody?
It was to these Moors 30 years ago that Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, then in their 20s, brought 4 of their 5 victims and buried their bodies. They've been known ever since as the Moors murderers, and their names reviled whenever details of their imprisonment has reached the press. But those crimes are now 30 years ago, and Myra Hindley is asking that her requests for parole be heeded. So, are there some crimes so terrible that those who committed them can never walk free? Or is she now reformed and no longer a danger to anyone? And should we, in the light of Christian charity, find it in our hearts to forgive even someone as wicked as Myra Hindley? When Myra Hindley and Ian Brady stood trial in 1966, there was public uproar and crowds outside the court. Around Manchester, feelings ran particularly high. A petition of 24,000 called for them to be hanged. Today, many aren't aware how terrible their crimes were. It's a story that unfolds with mounting horror. On Boxing Day 1964, 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey left her home in Ancoats, Manchester, to go to a fair nearby. There'd been a misunderstanding, and Leslie went alone there, without an adult's care.
I said, Leslie, I'm about to get tea ready, so it was 4 o'clock. Don't be later than 5 o'clock. When she wasn't home at 5 o'clock, something I knew.
You've gone to the fair?
She'd gone to the fair. In fact, Tommy, the middle one, he said, Mum, the last time I saw her, he was 8. He said she was on the wall of death. It's a wall they cling to or something. And she was laughing her head off. He said, stop, she was so happy. And he said that was the last time I saw her.
Leslie Ann never came home. For 10 months, Anne West and the man she was about to marry, Alan, waited not knowing what had happened.
We left her bedroom light on for 10 months. I never went to bed. Alan didn't go to bed. Was hoping that a couple who needed a child matters took her to look after her, and we left the lights on in case she dropped her off and she'd know where she was.
After 10 months they learned the truth. A news report on television told them a body had been found on the moors. Police had been tipped off by an in-law that Brady and Hindley had murdered 17-year-old Edward Evans. Investigations led them to Saddleworth Moor, east of Manchester. There they found the body of a little girl in a shallow roadside grave. The police insisted that only her mother could identify her.
I went in and I saw her clothes and said, don't be misled by the clothes. It could be another body of another child. What let us clothes? Brand new, Joe. And I mean, not thinking that, I said, why have you got so covered up? Let me see. Oh, God, I hope no mother in the world ever has to go through that. No mother. Oh, Father.
All this was terrible enough, but for Anne West, worse was to come. At the trial, the evidence included a tape recording which was played to the court. It confirmed that the couple had forced Leslie Ann to undress and pose for photographs. But it was the voice of the child pleading for mercy and crying out for her mother that chilled the court and all those who heard it. Leslie Ann's mother herself has never recovered. She was engulfed then by grief and hatred that in all the years since has never lifted.
She's not human. She couldn't be human to stand there and let a little girl, so innocent, 10-year-old, say, please let me go home to Mummy. And just say, shut up, else I'll give you another go that died.
Myra Hindley and Ian Brady had pleaded not guilty to 3 murders. Later she was to maintain she was not present when Brady sexually assaulted, then strangled Leslie Ann. But her role in all the murders was crucial. She it was, as the sympathetic woman, who had lured the children away. She drove the car, taking an unsuspecting John Kilbride to his death on the moors, even taking Leslie Ann's body there to be buried. She, the woman whose show of kindness proved deadly, is for some the more hated figure of the two.
Don't get me wrong, I hate her, but I detest her to stand by and let a little girl beat her. Where was her motherly instincts? And she made a remark in the paper, the only thing she's sorry for, that she never had any children. God forbid she did.
Ever since they went to prison, Anne West has followed the destiny of Brady and Hindley closely. Such consuming involvement has done nothing to soothe her continuing grief, and it has now ravaged her health. But every day Anne West remains adamant that Hindley and Brady should have hanged.
I believe in the Old Testament, an eye for an eye. And I don't think I would have had all these illnesses, because my doctor's specialist said it's all through the stress of what's happened, you know. And she's blooming in prison, she's blooming. And I'm serving my life sentence with no parole, and yet she can come up for parole.
Anne West campaigns continually against Myra Hindley ever having parole. She stays fully informed of what happens to Hindley. Phone calls tip her off about Hindley's every movement. The tabloid press come to her whenever they want a comment. In 1989 she published her book For the Love of Leslie, and is still receiving sacks of letters in response. It's her life's purpose to keep Myra Hindley in prison.
I wanted to die in prison. I think she should die in prison. The horrific things she's done, you know. And I think if she only knew it, she's helping to keep me alive. Because I don't intend dying until she's dead. I really don't.
Your life is in a way inextricably entangled with hers, isn't it?
Yes, it is. She took the most precious thing in the world away from me. My only daughter.
Ian Brady was found insane, moved to a mental hospital in 1985, and has gradually fallen from public attention. Not so Hindley. Her friendship with Lord Longford, who visited her in prison, helped keep her case in the public eye. Then in 1987 there was a major move on her part. She chose, after 21 years, to make a statement to the police, revealing she and Brady had killed 2 more children. She had already been taken to the moors to help find other bodies. Her statement read, "No words of mine can ever express the remorse I now feel for what I did, and my refusal for so long to admit to the crimes." In the face of the appalling nature of her crimes, the case for letting Myra Hindley out of this or any other prison must be very good indeed, and for forgiving her even more so. So what are the arguments, legal and moral, that could swing open these gates and let Myra Hindley free to live out her remaining days among the rest of us? Myra Hindley was born a Catholic, and while in prison has returned to her faith. Father Bert White is her priest at Cookham Wood Prison. He sees her regularly, believes that 28 years inside means she has paid her debt to society and now deserves parole. So what is the present Myra Hindley like?
Myra Hindley is a quiet, polite, intelligent, very knowledgeable about matters of faith, 51-year-old woman who makes me a cup of tea and sits and chats and receives Holy Communion from me on a Sunday morning, and bears absolutely no resemblance to the monstrous image that's been portrayed by the media, based on a touched-up photograph that's been taken nearly 30 years ago.
Does she speak of her regret, and is that a continuing state of mind?
24 hours a day, she says. She thinks about that. She bitterly regrets everything, all the things that were done 30 years ago, and all the people she's hurt. And she's quite a changed person, and that's been well written about.
A lot of people have commented how manipulative she is. You don't think she's pulling the wool over your eyes, do you?
I don't find her manipulative in that kind of a way. I think she has her own ideas, and she has her own mind about various things, and she states it just like anybody else does. But I suppose because she's Myra Hindley, people think, oh, well, she's controlling or conning, but she doesn't come over in that way to me.
Father White, who's also chaplain to the neighbouring Rochester Men's Prison, believes that Hindley's change is profound, an opinion, he insists, not incompatible with a revulsion at what she once did.
I feel the same kind of revulsion. We're talking about something that happened 30 years ago, and we're also talking about, as we are in this programme, a woman who has repented, who has confessed. We're talking about nearly 30 years on, and whether people allow other people to change. Because if we say, if we ask the questions, can people like Myra Hindley change? Should they be given a chance to change? Should that change be recognised and even rewarded? Now, if the answer is always going to be a very firm and a very frenzied scream of no, then actually what hope is there for anybody?
This isn't people who have an axe to grind saying it, but people who are doing their duty under the parole board functions have come to the conclusion that Myra Hindley has changed and is not dangerous. And so the only question then is to say, has she served her time? That is, has she served the period of retribution and of deterrence? And in my view, and this is simply, it can be well argued, and I believe other people have argued, that after some 30 years, you have certainly served that period of retribution and deterrence.
Some people feel that certain crimes are so appalling that life should mean for the whole of someone's natural life. Do you think that applies to Myra Hindley?
She would be the first to admit that her crimes are appalling. I mean, she has never minimised what happened all those years ago. But you first of all have to take it in the context that she was in love with Ian Brady, and at the time she did nothing to cast any blame or any responsibility which should have shifted to him. She took, as it were, joint responsibility. But had she not met Ian Brady, this young woman who was never in trouble with the police, who had a job as a secretary, would, in my view, have never crossed that line into crime. But she came under the sway of a very powerful and evil man, a psychopath.
There is a sentimental assumption which is not borne out by consideration of the papers. And by the way, this was not my view. It was put very powerfully to me by one of my most senior officials who spent most of his working life in this area. He took the view that Hindley was every bit as culpable as Brady. My reading of the papers was this was very much an equal partnership. You know, there's a sentimental assumption because Brady's a man and Hindley's a woman. Somehow, you know, he was the evil genius and she was just sort of Sancho Panza dragged along in his wake.
The tabloid newspapers have long been vocal in their hatred of Hindley, virtually running the campaign to keep her inside. They claim, of course, that they're merely reflecting popular outrage. But are they not also keeping ideas of hatred and revenge alive? And to what extent should public opinion decide how long people serve in prison? Do you seek to sway the feelings of your readers and the views of your readers?
No, I don't. On some subjects I would seek to sway the readers, but on something like this, I don't have to. I'd like to calm them down in a way rather than to wind them up, because I think they're wound up enough.
When you refer to her in your pages, do you call her an evil monster?
Yes, I have done in the past, because I think that the acts that she committed were evil.
Myra Hindley increases circulation. I've had senior crime writers and reporters from the tabloid newspapers tell me, quite frankly, that if Myra appears on the front page, their paper sells as many extra papers as if it's Princess Diana on the front page.
I think that the tabloid press are almost certainly the main movers in keeping her in sight, and I think there's a kind of hypocrisy on their part in the sense that every time the possibility of her release comes up, it allows them to rehash the very horrible details of the killings.
Is the tabloid press stirring everyone up into a lynch mob mentality that stops a cool assessment of the situation?
Yes, I mean, I think that is the most ludicrous thing I've heard. I mean, the tabloids can be accused of certain things, right? The tabloids can be accused of getting John Major back in, as Prime Minister. The tabloids can be accused of kids playing too many computer games. The tabloids cannot be accused of the murders of Leslie Ann Downey, of Edward Evans, of John Kilbride, of Keith Bennett and Pauline Reed. And this is what Myra Hindley did.
I think that women who kill are always treated more harshly than men who kill. There's a sort of assumption that a low violence isn't excusable in men. It's more natural to men because they're more aggressive and they're sort of predators and all that kind of thing. Whereas women who kill actually transgress a much greater taboo because women are still thought to be nurturing and caring and rather passive. And I think that Myra Hindley transgressed in two ways. She both killed and she killed children. She was involved in the murder of children, and therefore she can be put up as the kind of demon figure who is the opposite, the absolute opposite of the nurturing mother figure.
The readers of the People are very vociferous. I mean, I get an enormous amount of letters every week and phone calls from the readers, and I know that they do feel very strongly about punishment, and as much as they would like to be able to forgive in certain situations, there are situations where they feel it impossible to, and they share those feelings with us at the newspaper.
Would they write in about a Myra Hindley item?
Yes, they would. Yes, they would.
In great numbers?
Yes, yes.
And the prevailing view would be?
The prevailing view would be that she should serve life.
Any judge passing a life sentence has always recommended a term of years or tariff he believes the prisoner should serve. The final decision, which is the Home Secretary's, remained secret. However, last year the House of Lords required that each lifer be told what their tariff is. Myra Hindley expects to be told soon. When the tariff is up, the Home Secretary alone, after hearing the advice of a parole board, decides whether to release or not. Now, Michael Howard has stated that decision will also take into account its public acceptability.
When you're dealing with a human being's life and their entitlement to their liberty, I think to give it to one single individual, who of course is deeply affected by the politics of the situation, I think just is simply wrong. I think that the individual is entitled to consideration, however horrific the crime. I think that kind of decision has to be what we call judicialized, that is to say, has to come before some independent body which will ultimately make the decision.
It would be very foolish in a democracy to assert that there lies within our nation a body of people who, without any kind of democratic mandate, can actually be left entirely to their own devices to determine not the question of guilt or innocence, but the question of whether, when it is safe, or whether it is right to release a murderer onto the streets. Once a murderer has been convicted, his future liberty becomes forfeit to the public will. I personally think in a democracy it's a highly dangerous and damaging concept that there is somebody better able than a democratically elected politician to make those judgments.
But the Home Secretary spearheads government policy on law and order, setting out its strategy before an extremely vocal electorate. Would this not sway his judgment?
The Home Secretary is probably thinking to himself, if I were to release Myra Hindley today, what will be the political implications of that? And I think he would probably say to himself, there is a very large constituency out there which will regard my decision as being wholly unacceptable, and as a result of that there might be some political implication. He might even think that it could bring a government down. I don't think it would, of course, but I think he might well feel that. He's a political animal, and therefore is affected by those kinds of considerations.
When there is a case for taking on the prejudices of the tabloid editorial writers, when there is no principle that underpins what they say, which is more often than not the case, politicians are perfectly well able and have a strong enough moral fibre to take them on. And this has been done on a number of occasions in cases where I was involved in. In relation to Brady and Hindley, it is not the tabloid writers demonizing Hindley that is actually causing her continued incarceration. It is much more fundamental than that. It is the sense that the confidence of the public in the British criminal justice system would be shaken to its very roots were a decision made to release her. That's my view, and I hope that will continue to be the view of Home Office ministers.
It's the politician, in this case the Home Secretary or his juniors, who make a decision, notwithstanding the person's done their tariff, notwithstanding that they're no longer dangerous. He looks out the window and says, yep, no, I'm going to add another 10 years to this person. And the thing, what is happening here is what's happened in Russia in the, in the communist times, that people would serve their 20 years and just at the end they say, no, another 10 years are slapped on. A political decision.
The Home Secretary will soon be informing Myra Hindley for the first time exactly how long her sentence is to be. She was first recommended for parole 9 years ago. If she's to serve many more years yet, there are plans to appeal to Europe.
I think it is a fundamental part of the British society that decisions about what should happen to murderers should be taken within Britain, not by people of whom they've never heard, legal functionaries from Luxembourg and so on. And I personally think the European Court of Human Rights would test the patience of the British political system to breaking point were they to do anything like that.
While the legal system speaks in terms of punishment and reform, morality speaks of repentance and forgiveness. So is it possible after 30 years to forgive Myra Hindley? Now you might well think that's easy enough to say for someone who hasn't been deeply wounded by what she did. But if justice is to mean more than revenge, Christian morality requires us to forgive. So is it possible to forgive someone who murdered your child?
That dilemma confronted Beth Ellis 6 years ago, when her 28-year-old son Adam was killed. Adam suffered from schizophrenia, but with regular medication and a supportive family was settling into a stable way of life. His illness had also brought him particularly close to his mother, who was optimistic all was coming right for him.
He was just about to start a training. He'd been accepted for a new school, that he was killed on the Thursday, and he would start this new school on the Tuesday, which was learning to frame and frame prints and pictures, which of course he would have loved because he loved painting. But that never happened because of course he was killed before he ever got the chance to start it.
Adam had gone fishing at the canal near his home in West London. Out of the blue he was attacked, hit on the head, and then stabbed through the heart by a single assailant. That such brutality could end such a gentle life stunned his family.
I was just desolate and disbelieving, confused, and an enormous feeling of loss because I had worked for 12 years with Adam through the ups and downs of this illness, and it looked like we were getting there, and he was happy and he was loving, and it was just after my 60th birthday, and typical Adam, he had bought me the most expensive present, and he said, I know this comes from a very expensive shop, but I've got all my social security up to date, and I've paid my rent up to date, and I want you to have this, Mum. And, I just stood in tears at this incredible thing that Adam had, this love for people.
Beth Ellis, despite her sense of outrage at what has happened, does not want revenge against Adam's killer, who's now in prison.
if I punished him, if I hit him over the head or whatever I wanted to do in anger, Adam would still be dead. I might have got a bit of my anger out of me, but I didn't feel anger that much. I felt, what did I feel? I felt sort of just enormous sadness that he had done this and ruined his own life and his mother's, his whole family's.
Adam had been a committed Christian and active in his local church, the only one of his family with such convictions. But since his death, Beth Ellis and her remaining children, Amanda and Hugo, have joined Adam's church and become active there themselves. It has helped them to reach a stage of forgiving his killer.
If I let him lie unforgiven, I myself am affected by this. I would wake up in a sweat of anger and hatred, and I wanted to move on. I didn't want to be a victim as well as Adam. I didn't want my life to also be destroyed, and everybody that I met. That boy destroyed Adam's life. He killed Adam's life here, but my life is still continuing, and everybody that I contact is affected by me. How could I possibly do anything worthwhile with my life while I was going around in this lather of unforgiveness? And then plus the fact that having become a Christian, I realized that the greatest witness of all, of course, was the man that hung on a cross, with people spitting and throwing things at him. And I always get this image of this man with no clothes on, hanging on a cross in front of all those people, with his mum there, with the ladies. Everybody else had fled, but the women were there. And then saying, "Forgive them, Father. They know not what they do." To me, that's so incredible.
Adam's killer, sentenced to life, could be free within 10 years. Beth Ellis has lived through her grief enough to want to meet him when he's released.
I would love to think that he has somehow, through the prison chaplain himself, come to some sort of healing, come to some sort of repentance, and reconciliation. And if that is the case, I would love to meet Christopher.
But Beth, that's so idealistic. Just suppose that he might be a mindless young thug who doesn't have any remorse.
Yes, that would be very difficult. That would be very difficult. Mind you, it does say, love your enemies, doesn't it, in the Bible? Anybody, it says, can love your friends. It takes an extra bit of grace, a bit of help, to love enemies. And so therefore I'd hand that over and see. I just pray that something has happened to touch his heart, to change him from the person that he was into something else.
The peculiar horror and prolonged suffering of Anne West's child, so graphically revealed on the tape, has tested her faith to the limit. Now, when this terrible thing happened to your family, what did you have to say to God about it? Did you feel...
I was very angry with God, very angry with God. In fact, for a while I did lose my faith, Joan, I did lose my faith. But we had a wonderful minister. Bless him, is dead now, Mr. Ford. And he restored my faith. He really did. He said God wanted Leslie, and I said, no, I'm not having that. He could have taken it a different way if he'd have wanted her. But I did come round eventually to go back to church, you know. Never thought.
Anne West lost the baby she was expecting in the time following her daughter's murder. More recently, she has been seriously ill, and her husband Alan has had to give up work to care for her. They are on mobility and care allowances. With a life so shattered, it's not surprising the thought of Myra Hindley seeking release continues to feed her bitterness.
I say the Lord's Prayer. But there's one part in the Lord's Prayer I just cannot bring myself to say. I have to say it now to you, but it's forgive them their trespasses. I cannot say that in my prayer. I omit that.
Personal stories of suffering such as these point up the anguish of such moral dilemmas. Yet even in the more abstract terms of moral laws as taught by the Church, there are differences of opinion as to what Christianity requires, each genuinely seeking to reach the truth of how Christians should behave towards Hindley.
People can visit her and love her and support her through writing letters or whatever, but it doesn't mean that society can say that that debt is yet repaid. I think of a case 2 years ago, I think in Florida, where there was a serial killer who definitely, I think, as far as I know, came to Jesus, was therefore saved, but he accepted that he should be executed, I think, electric chair, whatever it is they use in Florida. Now, I think he'd understood, perhaps a little bit more than perhaps Myra Hindley does, what the teachings of the Bible are. That yes, you can be individually saved, and God can forgive you, and you can receive the love of your fellow man, but even so, you have to go through with the punishment.
Unless forgiveness comes in, the spiral of violence, as it has been called, just continues to spiral. Unless somebody comes in and says it stops here, we will forgive. That doesn't mean, of course, that I don't understand people who feel terrible hurt, terrible pain, terrible grief about what's happened. It's tragic, it's deplorable. But and we understand that, and neither does it mean that you condone anything, because immediately you say forgiveness is really the only way to go forward and to heal the situation. The moment you say that, people say, oh, well, you're condoning, you're on her side, and you're forgetting the victims. It's so hard to hold both in there and believe in a God who's present in both situations.
So in your view, God was with Leslie Ann Downey?
God was in Leslie Ann Downey. God was with her mother, and is with her mother, feeling the pain and the anger and the total frustration with the whole situation.
And God is with Myra Hindley? And
God is with Myra Hindley.
We as individuals can certainly forgive. I don't think society is Christian. I don't think society, therefore, gets involved in the issue of forgiveness. The key really is that only God can forgive an individual. And if God has forgiven Myra Hindley, then I'm delighted for her. But God will decide that. It's between Myra Hindley and God.
Human wickedness is hard to come to terms with. Indeed, it's one of the mainstays of our moral framework that we should never come to terms with it. But we have to acknowledge change and live in the hope of forgiveness. Without such things, our lives are bereft of meaning. As we witness the pain and grief of Leslie Ann's mother and consider Myra Hindley's repentance, we need to find space for them both in the judgments we make. An edited transcript of tonight's programme is available. For your copy, please send a cheque for £2 to Can We Forgive Myra Hindley, Heart of the Matter, P.O. Box 7, London W3 6XJ.